Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. The Prince of the City, Rudy Giuliani, New York and the genius of American life. I'm skeptical. Here to assuage my skepticism is Fred Siegel, professor of history at Cooper Union, a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute. His last book, The Future Once Happened Here, New York, D.C., L.A., and the Fate of America's Big City, has been called one of the most important books on the United States in the 20th century. He is a New York resource, a public intellectual, and a frequent combatant. Fred, welcome.
Well, thanks, Doug.
Let's go to the title.
Sure.
The Prince of the City. Let's start with that.
It refers to Machiavelli's The Prince. This is not a work of political science. This is meant to be a metaphor. Machiavelli was about replacing Christian virtues, which he said had failed Italy, failed Florence, with older virtues of the classical world: steadfastness, courage, discipline.
Virtue.
So substituting one set of virtues for another. Giuliani substituted the virtues of liberal New York: compassion, indulgence, charity. He substituted those for those virtues: steadfastness, courage, work, accountability. So at the core of the book is the history of liberalism in New York: how it arose, how it developed, how it failed, and then how Giuliani rescues the city, essentially, through this reversal of virtues. The subtitle, The Genius of American Life, speaks to the idea of upward mobility. The great failing, or one of the great failings of New York liberalism, was it treated the poor as a permanently dependent class, not people who could rise in life as earlier generations had, but as an industry to be taken care of. Giuliani replaced that with the idea of upward mobility. Unfortunately, under Bloomberg, we're reverting to the older Dickens-like idea.
Okay. Talk then about, a little bit more about Rudy Giuliani as Machiavellian. We tend to think of Machiavellian in a pejorative way. Talk about it in the more benign way, as well as his Machiavellianism in the less noble way.
The founding fathers of the United States loved Machiavelli because he was concerned about how things really worked. And that's at the core of Giuliani. He wasn't concerned about the rhetoric of compassion. So people like Lindsay and Dinkins endlessly preached compassion and kindness and delivered poverty, higher crime rates, and misery.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ellipsis in there.
There's a lot there.
Okay.
But it's that disjuncture between the rhetoric of New York's liberalism and the reality of what it delivered that stands at the heart of this. Now, Giuliani's idea was that the city wasn't helpless. It wasn't a ward, shouldn't be a ward of Washington, that it could assert its independence just as people on welfare could assert their independence. That was really at the core of what he tried to do. So in a sense, this is really a book about, not just about Giuliani, but about Giuliani's relationship to the failures of liberalism in New York. Okay.
And one of the things that you argue that Giuliani fought against was this notion of ungovernableness. I mean, in fact, it was the title of a well-known book, The Ungovernable City by Doug Yates. And Giuliani took this as his opportunity to prove this untrue. Talk about that.
Well, if you go back to the 1993 election, what's interesting is the mood of resignation. Most people assume that no matter who wins in 93, the city is going to get worse. There's a sense that, and there's an evacuation mentality. A New York Times survey of roughly 2/3 of the people who are able to want to leave. And Sam Roberts, one of the city's best reporters, writes a series of articles in the Times, and he says, basically, not much can be done. The city, because it's so dependent on Washington, so dependent on Albany, and so at the mercy of larger economic forces, the city is really helpless. And there's a larger sense beyond this that the underclass, criminal underclass, is permanent and here to stay. Senator Moynihan is utterly despairing.
Right.
He gives testimony and says, given the out-of-wedlock birth rate, the city's future is already determined. It's over.
And he's talking about a dumbing down of deviance.
A defining down of deviance,
Right.
yes, that, the sense that the deviant has become normal. That's what Giuliani breaks with on all grounds. Now, when he comes into office, there's enormous skepticism, again, among his supporters that anything can be done. The fear when he takes office is not that it'll do too much, not that it'll do too little, but that it'll do too much. That anything that's done will set off rioting and violence after the rioting and violence of the Dinkins years.
So it wasn't that it was going to be ineffective, but that it was going to be almost arsonist.
Exactly. That Giuliani's attempts at reform would put the city to the torch.
The city, I'm here. The city is not a tinderbox in 1993.
No, it's not. But in 1993, 1994, it was a tinderbox. Many of the people who were supporters of Dinkins were talking openly that if Giuliani wins, there'll be riots. And this idea of riot was central to the city's life back to the Lindsay years. In the Lindsay years, the mythology of the Lindsay years was there were no riots because we never had a riot on the scale of Watts. We had many small riots.
Or what were known as slow motion riots.
Or later. Well, that comes later. The slow motion riots are the permanent rise in crime rates. But within the Lindsay years, there are dozens upon dozens of riots, mostly suppressed in the papers because the papers are cooperating with Lindsay. In the years that follow, this problem of riot, the threat of violence continues. It's there. Beam tries to use it in 1975 with bankruptcy. He warns, in effect, that there'll be riots unless the feds come to our rescue. Giuliani breaks with this riot ideology. He says, I'm not going to be moved. And the key moment here is the Harlem Mosque incident. There had been an earlier Harlem Mosque incident in 1972, I think it was 72, when Lindsay and his police commissioner Murphy essentially acceded to Louis Farrakhan and his minions. When there was a repeat of a similar incident, Giuliani did not back down. He made it clear there was a new, this is Bratton's words at the time, there's a new sheriff in town.
Sounds like an Eddie Murphy line. No? Yes.
It is.
In 48 hours,
it is,
right.
It is an Eddie Murphy line.
So how does the sheriff behave? Clearly you see Bratton, Comstat, Giuliani as breaking this liberal paradigm and producing these incredible results. Talk about that.
Well, first of all, the expectations are very low. Giuliani gives a speech about a month into office. He says, we can't really do a great deal about crime probably for 10 years. We can curb it, we can contain it. So what comes as a surprise to everyone, probably except Bratton, because Bratton had already accomplished a great deal in the subways.
And in Boston.
But even more in the subways.
Yep.
Where broken windows policing have been applied. Broken windows means you take care of the small things. You don't ignore graffiti.
Kelly and Wilson.
You don't ignore fare beaters. If you arrest fare beaters, 1 out of 7 will turn out to have outstanding felony warrants.
And then the larger issue is that symbols of disorder produce behavior that produces more disorder.
Exactly.
So you got this downward spiral.
So you begin with broken windows. That's a success. And then you add Comstat, which has been evolving implicitly. And Jack Maple and Bratton begin to chart on a day-to-day basis where crimes are taking place. And the police become a ready reaction force.
So technology, the computer technology allows data to be done almost in real time rather than waiting a month for crime data.
The computer technology had already been there for quite a while.
Okay.
What changed is the conception of... The conception was that if you could map crime, you wouldn't just displace it. In the 80s, Giuliani and D'Amato and a lot of politicians, Ben Ward, then the police commission, would go on these sweeps. My office in Cooper Union is right near one of the sweeps. You'd sweep Alphabet City, and all the crime would move over a few blocks.
And then I remember that famous photograph of Giuliani and D'Amato and I think a U.S. attorney dressed up as drug dealers. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So what the difference was this time, the drug dealers moved, and then you got them the next day. They moved, and they moved, and they moved. Today, drug dealing is largely indoors. The outdoor drug markets, which define neighborhoods and define the streets, the public life in New York, are gone. We haven't eliminated drugs. We pushed it indoors. That's an enormous accomplishment. Now, sometimes it's argued, well, crime was beginning to decline under Dinkins. That's true, but only marginally, and only in those areas, this is important, where something like broken windows policing was already in effect, where the business improvement districts in Midtown were policing in a minute way. The other thing is that stranger crime. That's the most frightening kind of crime. Not within a family, among friends, but random crime with strangers. That hadn't declined at all. So Bratton and Giuliani achieved this enormous success. And here's something important, because Freddie Ferrer has repeatedly been mistaken in how he describes this. Crime drops long before the economy recovers. The economy doesn't recover until the third quarter of 1996. Crime is dropping dramatically by the second half of 1994.
So the paradigm was policing would not have an impact on the crime rate. The new paradigm is you can affect it using this epidemiological model.
Yes.
I am almost
yes,
got
that's
that
very good.
out.
That's very
and
good.
Also, what was interesting at that when I was first introduced to CompStat is that it was the first time that you had all the commanders in the same room where they could actually learn from each other's experience in dealing with these problems, which they had never done before.
Well, take these in parallel. On one hand, every morning, you have Giuliani's 8 o'clock meeting when all the department heads are brought together. And you have Bratton's early morning meeting where all the precinct commanders are brought together. We were very lucky. We had two guys who really thought about management in a way and path-breaking ways. And part of the book, I talk about what I call the ferment of the early 1990s. The early 1990s were a special period. Partisan lines broke down, and it was a widespread attempt to rethink government. What's wrong with government? How do we make it work? The Clinton campaign comes out of this. The Giuliani campaign comes out of this.
And then you've got the Osborne and Gabler books on reinventing government. You've got bringing in private management theories into the public sector.
Exactly. And it bears enormous fruit for us in New York. And it's been a model for people around the country. Hasn't always succeeded elsewhere. One of the things that Bratton recognized is that our police force was highly professional, highly competent, but it hadn't been used effectively. And here again we go back to Machiavelli. One of Machiavelli's worries is that when soldiers are merely mercenaries, when they have no mission, they won't do a very effective job. But policing aside, one of the unknown stories, one of the things that's not known about the early years of the administration is how close we came to a takeover by the Financial Control Board.
Right.
The city, when Giuliani takes office, I don't think this has been published anywhere. People don't know about this. The Financial Control Board is looking at the city and saying, "You're bankrupt. We're going to take you over." The city can't pay its bills. Abe Lackman, who's the first budget director, keeps warding people off. He slows down repayment, and slowly and very slowly, the city works its way out of the situation, but not until there's a very serious confrontation with the Financial Control Board. Because the Financial Control Board, like most of the political establishment, assumes Giuliani can't govern. The city, A, is ungovernable. Everyone knows this. B, he's a Republican, as everyone knows this is a Democratic town.
Right.
And B, he has no experience in government. How could he possibly do this? The key here is that Giuliani was much smarter than his opponents. And what I mean by that is he understood what the change in the city charter meant. Under the
1989, go ahead, explain the 1989 charter.
Before 1989, we had a Board of Estimate, and the power of the mayor was diffused by the Board of Estimate.
And this Board of Estimate consisted of the 3 citywide officials and the 5 borough officials.
And that meant any project that had to be done, any major initiative, had to involve log rolling. You had to pay everyone off to do it. Dinkins takes office. He's potentially the most powerful mayor in the history of the city.
In the same election that the charter is changed by the voters.
Exactly. But he doesn't know what to do with this power. This is a little unfair, but not entirely. Even some of his friends described him as the borough president of the city. He presided, but he didn't govern. Giuliani studies the charter like Napoleon studies the map of a battlefield. And he sees where the leverage is. And that's what allows him to contain excessive spending. You have to understand the nature of the city council and how important Peter Vallone was in Giuliani's success.
Yes, in fact, I mean, if there's a subhead, or in addition, it's Giuliani in parentheses and Peter Vallone, New York and the Genius of American Life, because he seems to be a real partner in this.
Vallone is absolutely essential. You have to understand how dysfunctional the city council is. Right after Dinkins' defeat, the city council has a vicious debate. The city has lost 325,000 jobs, a quarter of all the jobs lost in the recession. The rest of the country is out of the recession. We won't be out of it for another 3.5 years. What is the city council debating? Cruelty to horses in Central Park. And the issue is, who are the victims here? The horses or the Irish drivers? Is this anti-Irish bigotry or anti-animal bigotry? Vallone, because of his broader vision, becomes a partner with Giuliani and limits the damage the city council can do. And he actually makes the council a partner.
Now, he's doing this on the basis of his own personality rather than institutionally or structurally based reasons.
Well, Vallone, I describe Giuliani as an immoderate centrist, and Vallone is a temperamental moderate. Vallone has a broader vision of the city. They share a lot of values in common. They're both outer borough guys.
Right.
One of the interesting things about the early 90s is the loss of power in Manhattan. Manhattan had been strangling the city and the state for a long time, and so you have Giuliani, the first mayor to be elected in the century without the support of Manhattan, and you had Pataki, who wins with the lowest vote total in Manhattan of any winning candidate of a governor in the 20th century,
right.
The first upstate governor in 70 years. And part of this is that Manhattan's confidence in itself had been shaken. The sense of collapse, of decline. Dickens even gives a speech at one point. He says the very existence of the city is threatened. This is 1993. The very existence is, 92 or 93. The very existence, the very survival of the city is in doubt. He doesn't mean it literally. What he means is that if things continue to go this way, we'll end up like Philadelphia or Detroit. So Vallone sees this. Vallone, even before Giuliani, wants more police.
Right. I mean, Safe Streets, Safe City is a Dickens-Vallone initiative.
It's a Dickens-Vallone initiative. And so Vallone is important in becoming the guy Giuliani can work with to get this done. But on some things, Giuliani is by himself. For instance, the whole question of terrorism and anti-terrorism. One of the interesting things about Giuliani is how far ahead of the curve he is on this. This is not widely known, but he would have been the guy to prosecute the killers of Leon Klinghoffer had they been brought back to the United States. Instead, they were sent to Italy where they were released. When Kahana, the radical right-wing rabbi Meir Kahana is killed in 1989, Giuliani understands this is not some random killing, as the FBI assume, and the NYPD understands it as well.
Well, the NYPD was much more savvy to what was going on. John Miller wrote a book, The Cell, that lays out the knowledge of the city and the ignorance of the feds.
Giuliani puts this all together, and what people have forgotten is in the very first day in office, he gives his inaugural address. The pride of place goes not to crime, not to the fantastic job losses, not to the sense of demoralization, but to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and what that meant for the city and what it meant for the future. That's the central focus of his first inaugural address. So the question of terror is there from the beginning. For those people who are interested in the history of the city, there's an appendix which deals with plots, real and seriously imagined, to destroy New York, going all the way back to the Civil War, the Southerners in the Civil War, then the Kaiser, and forward to Hitler and bin Laden. But Giuliani makes some mistakes along the way. Obviously, putting the command center in the World Trade Center was an enormous mistake. However, the criticism of the time was not that he was putting it there, although there were a few officers like Lou Anamone who saw the problem immediately. The idea was this was a non-problem. Terrorism was something that Giuliani was making up, that he was paranoid. And he was widely mocked for this, for being concerned with terrorism. Now, there's another element, I think, to the story that's not well known, and that is the revival of city neighborhoods. And here, one of the key players is a woman named Debbie Wright, who's now president of Carver National Bank, who came out of, African-American woman who came out of the Dinkins administration.
I know Debbie.
The story of how it was extraordinarily bright and competent.
Yes.
The story of how she goes from the Dinkins administration to the Giuliani administration, I tell for the first time. Now, the reason this is significant is it's Debbie's ideas about restoring home ownership in Harlem that dramatically accelerate the revival of Harlem that is very nearly derailed in 1995 with Freddie's fire, when Sharpton gooses the paranoia of his followers, and one of them, Morris Powell, an escaped mental patient, helped set off the murder of 7 people. The future of Harlem is very nearly cut off there. Debbie Wright again steps in. She heads up the Harlem Development Corporation, Harlem Empowerment Zone, and it goes back on track. But this question of the revival of neighborhoods is enormously important. The reason it's important is that Giuliani's virtues were sometimes his political failings. If you compare Giuliani to other mayors, say Daley in Chicago, good mayors, Daley in Chicago, Daley reduces crime in downtown, but crime explodes in the rest of Chicago, and he does nothing about it. Giuliani's virtue is that he treats crime in Harlem every bit as seriously as he treats crime in Midtown. That's his virtue. It's also his failing, because it generates enormous hostility. But the net result is that when the economy revives and crime is reduced, You have an efflorescence of neighborhoods of unprecedented proportions. So, there were bummer shoots there, were already there in the boom of the 80s.
Right.
But it takes off and it continues.
But part of this is outside of his control, and that is immigration law that allowed these immigrants to come into the city, that revitalized these neighborhoods with, they augmented the gene pool, their energy, their business savvy.
But that argument has a problem, Doug, and that is that immigration had already exploded in the 80s. None of this happens in the 80s. The key here is immigration helps.
Okay.
It's the raw material.
Okay.
But it's the reduction in crime.
It's a necessary condition.
It's a necessary condition, but it's not nearly sufficient.
Okay.
A builder, Rich Richmond, a very sharp builder, said to me, he said, it used to be I had to be very careful about where I wanted to build in New York. Now I can build anywhere.
Okay.
And that's the question. That's the question of crime reduction. When we come to the question of welfare reform, the interesting thing is, initially, it's a financial matter. The city is teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. It literally cannot afford the cost of 1.1 million people on welfare. And the success plays out again in a number of phases, but most importantly, Giuliani understands that the size of the welfare rolls are not a function of the economy. There's very little relationship. Just as there's let me emphasize this, there is no relationship between crime rates and the economy. If you ask people what was the decade of the 20th century with the lowest crime rates, it's the 1930s.
The Depression. Yes,
the Depression.
Thank you. Do I get?
You get credit.
Thank
you get extra credit.
Thank you.
That the rules are what's important, and you see this even as we go into recession after 2000. After summer of 2000, we move into recession. After summer 2001, we move into recession. Welfare rolls don't explode again, and nor does suffering. This is one of the few things Daniel Patrick Moynihan ever got fundamentally wrong. So much of what he does in the first few years is driven by sheer necessity. If you don't get crime under control, the city doesn't have a future. If you don't get welfare under control, the city will be taken over by the state financial control board. And he and Vallone are agreed, partly because they don't have a great deal of respect for the financial control board. They think they know, and rightly so, much more about how the city really works than the financial control board. Now, there's a period in 1994 where Giuliani becomes enormously popular among liberal Democrats, and that's because he endorses Mayor Cuomo. And if we ask why, the reason, again, is simple. The city's finances. He had to have Cuomo's help to avoid a financial control board.
And he didn't see Pataki as providing that help, or the Republican legislature.
No, he did not see eventually. And so what happens is after 94, and this is part of Giuliani's skill as a manager, he completely shifts strategies. It's 1994, the Republicans have taken over Congress. Pataki is in Albany. He now goes to Albany and says, you know what, give me less money. A couple of times. Less money from you means less matching funds for me, less that I have to spend. He's the first mayor to see that less can be more. And he's the first mayor to understand that our relationships with Albany and Washington are completely dysfunctional. Now, sometimes politicians get up and say, we give so much more to Washington than we get back, but they don't follow it to where it leads. Okay, then rethink the relationship, because we're never going to get more. Our power is only going to decline.
Right.
New York, as a percentage of the American population, is half of what it was in 1950. So Giuliani begins this redefinition, and it looks like it's going to take hold. Unfortunately, in his wake, we reverted to a Dinkins-like mayor in Bloomberg, who once again thinks that Washington is going to help us.
Okay, so you've got this overarching change in terms of perception, standards, etc., and you've got concrete results in police and welfare, etc. So at the end of his 8 years, the city is a substantially better place.
It is, but there are failures and errors, and let's deal with the three most significant. The first is the firing of Bratton. This was an enormous mistake.
Ego.
Well, these men were both ramrods. When they were in the room together, there wasn't enough room for anyone else to breathe.
Right, they sucked the oxygen out of the room.
Part of it is not that one guy had an ego and the other. They were so similar. They were both dominant personalities. They were both brilliant. They were both relentlessly disciplined. They were both commanding presences.
So Bratton had to go.
So Bratton had to go.
Number two.
But that was a mistake. Number two is his attempt to try to sell the water supply. He's blocked here by Steve Newman and Alan Hevesy. That's a real benefit to the city. The third mistake, which is a long-term mistake, is in his last 2 years in office, he allows the budget to reflate.
He plays the same game. He's buying everybody off.
Well, actually, it's not so much that he's buying everyone off. Essentially, he's got his finger in the dike, and there's this tremendous pressure he holds back. He relaxes. He doesn't contain spending.
Yeah, but also he's running for the Senate. He's got these presidential ambitions.
The trouble with that is, the trouble with the Senate argument is it continues after he stops running for the Senate. In other words, this is something larger.
Okay.
As for presidential ambitions, they began after his victory in '97. I don't think they have much to do with the spending. I think in the case of it's hard to explain what this was about. In talking to people in the administration, they don't give me a very good explanation.
Okay, so there were failures here. We're running out of time. I mean, we're going too fast. Rudy in 2008, where does Rudy go? He's America's mayor. He performs brilliantly during 9/11, converts that into a lucrative private business, and probably the most well-known, respected Paul out there. What happens? You got 30 seconds.
He's leading in the Republican polls. A lot depends on what happens in the 2006 elections. If the Republicans do badly in the 2006 congressional elections, which I suspect they will, for a whole variety of reasons, Giuliani will become much more of a viable candidate. He will become a stronger candidate. A lot of social conservatives who dislike him are willing to overlook.
Are they?
Yes.
Because he's on the wrong side of the culture wars here.
Pat Robertson made a statement last week saying, Rudy Giuliani is a great guy. I don't agree with him on X, Y, and Z, but I can support him.
Okay.
In other words, had he had no record to go on, but he has a proven record of achievement, that allows him to overcome some of that opposition.
Okay. Last question. Can he do it? Can he win, or is this dream exactly that?
If he gets the Republican nomination, he would have a very good chance to win because he's purple, and most of the country's purple.
Okay.
In other words, the kind of hawkish foreign policy, tolerant social policy he represents is where the country is. And so, if he got the Republican nomination, he'd be a formidable candidate.
Last word. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Time flies.